Welcome back to another episode of Perligo Ponders, which I respond to your comments, questions, and theories about the lore and music of 21 Pilots. Questions relating to my own comments, questions, and theories about the music and lore of 21 Pilots. As always, if you would like your comment to be featured in the next episode, just comment something you find interesting down below. Feel free to flag it as Perligo Ponders if you'd like, but I don't just pull from comments with that flag. I just pull comments that are interesting to me and that I want to include. Next up, we have a comment from L.A. Volpa. Random thought I had I think you would appreciate. Young Gravestones promised me this: if I lose for myself, you won't mourn a day and you'll move on to someone else. Then we watch City Walls, and at the end, Clancy loses to himself and the temptation to power. And Torchbearer, without missing a beat, moves on to try again. We were literally handed the ending. Yeah, and in a song like Neon Gravestones, which to me is a lore song. It's an element of the city of Dema that we see in the lore. And yeah, this idea, I think it's an interesting question, right? Is the Clancy at this point writing this song the same Clancy who makes that final attempt in City Walls, or is he one who makes an attempt before that final one, right? It really depends how you see those albums. I think I would be of the opinion that it is the same one that we see make that final attempt in City Walls, who writes this song. You know, he's going through the cycle. He hasn't hit Skeleton Icy yet or anything like that. He doesn't know the Torchbearer's plan. He doesn't necessarily know what's going to happen at the end. But I think he's gearing up to try to become a rebel. There's definitely a sentiment from him that this is like an all or nothing mission. But he doesn't want his defeat to turn him into a glorious Gon, or I guess in this case, a bishop who is just accepted as, all right, well, that's what Clancy was supposed to be, without moving on to the next Clancy. Hopefully that made sense. But I mean, in short, yes, definite connection there, and a really cool one that came to mind, I think, for a lot of people right after City Walls came out. Next, we have a comment from Mike Squires. The line from Bandito and Overcompensate, "I created this world to feel some control," could be where the idea of Clancy being the original creator comes from, given that the story is a metaphor for mental health and struggles you have with it as an individual. If I remember correctly, I think this comment was in relation to a discussion we had about Clancy and vialism and whether or not Clancy was sort of responsible for that. Not necessarily the Clancy we see here, but a version of Clancy in the past. Did he in some way found dema and create vialism? That was sort of all a question we were pondering about. So in a lot of ways, this line and this sentiment here, this idea can relate to that question that we were considering, but can also relate to the story as a whole. It's just a good point in general that we see this line, create this world to feel some control, this confirmation that Clancy, or Tyler at the very least, created the world of Dema. And he created it as a place for him to control his fears and doubts and anxieties and sort of wage this war in his head in a controlled environment between these two sides of him. I mean, he talks about this with Blurryface, right? The idea of creating Blurryface is to give his fears a seat the table and a name so he can sort of address them. But I think also it's like a way for him to, in a controlled burn, in a controlled way, try to figure out how to overcome and defeat his fears. Almost doing this extended grand thought experiment in this world. There's potentially even a sense in which he feels like he loses control over the world that he's created, and that's part of the struggle here. Part of how he loses himself. Certainly in a lore aspect, you could see it as like he creates this, or it's a dream, he has control over whatever. He enters it to try to create this experiment. I mean, I think even I put out a theory video about this about a year ago. Right? He creates Blurryface as an experiment. It kind of spirals out of control, and he loses control and finds himself trapped under Blurryface, under the control of Blurryface in this world that Tyler created, which he now no longer has control of. And it's certainly one way of looking at that line from Bandito at the very least. But certainly it's true that it speaks to it sort of breaks the fourth wall and speaks to the fact that Tyler created all this world to control everything that he's trying to understand. But again, we see that line in Lameboy, tempted by control, controlled by temptation. We see the sentiment at the end of the story as well. He created it to feel some control, and perhaps that was his undoing, and that's how he got trapped and stuck in the cycle. I've always thought of it to be similar to when you're really struggling, you'll daydream or disassociate and create a world where you can control everything. I mean, he even has that line, disassociate, I'm navigating my head. If we see navigating as a song that can be related to the lore, certainly its music video is, even if the song itself doesn't have a ton of explicit references to that. And this is one that I think does relate. Disassociate, I'm navigating my head, I'm trying to find my way through this thought experiment I've created. Hopefully that answers your question. I think it's a good question. Next, we have a comment from Make It With Alex, who often shows up in these streams. She writes, Perligo ponders the dates And all the Clancy letters and correspondence in dema are dated as moon dates, and the revised or the revisited music video clips in City Walls now at night includes the moon. I think that is because Tyler, or Clancy, has his mental health battles at night, and it seems right to have the scene set at night. But can't help but wonder if the moon also represents the light, like with the drag path, the bunny being saved by the moon, which is also the light. What are your thoughts? This sort of ties in, and I can't remember if there were other questions that I pulled up for Perligo Ponders tonight about this idea or not, so apologies in advance if we sort of discuss the same topic again in a couple of questions. But this ties into something we're talking about, where we're looking at this interview with Tyler in which he explains that one of the things that he found really interesting about the video Out of a Forest, which was used for drag path, is that there's this moon sitting in the background of a lot of the shots. It's just kind of there. You think it's just to establish context, to set the scene, but it ends up being the thing that saves the rabbit in the end. This really stuck out to me when watching the interview because it seemed like he was sort of dropping a hint or a clue about the story, because one, he seemed really excited and passionate about it when he was talking about it, but also it was something that really inspired him, right? This video as a whole really inspired him. There's a lot of other parallels we've drawn. You know what I'm talking about. I don't need to rehash all of this, but anyway, the reason why we're talking about the moon here is because of that. And so we see this image of a moon sort of appearing in the tail end of the story. The contract music video had a light that really looked similar to that white moon. City Walls, the flashbacks to Jumpsuit, are suddenly at night with a big moon there. The Heathens Trees live stream segment has a big moon. It's supposed to be set at night, but it, again, we see this imagery of a moon inserted into the story a lot. But that is something that we're noticing now, obviously, because he mentioned the moon. But it is also something that, especially for the contract and the Jumpsuit flashback, I noticed that there was a comparison between the contract and the Jumpsuit flashback in City Walls, in that they both kind of played on this concept of the moon before we saw the Drag Path music video. And the moon is something that, again, I think we've seen more recently, but it wasn't a huge part of the story up until now. Except for what Make It With Alex mentions here. The fact that dema dates things by the moon. And that always seemed really weird. An in-world sort of thing, a world-building story element, without it really being clear why they would do that. Why that's how they would date their calendars. So it's interesting now, retrospectively, with this context in mind of the moon being an important figure. And so it certainly got me thinking, it's like, okay, well, if the moon was a big thing that was important and saved the bunny in the end in Drag Path, is that a role that it's playing in this story? And I think right off the bat, obviously, it's worthwhile to look at references to the moon as a parallel to that video and what Tyler said. But I suspect, it seems to me, that it isn't the moon in the Trench story or the dema story that is really what we're supposed to be looking at. I think having the moon there in the story, and I could be proven wrong on this, it's just been a couple of admittedly very busy weeks in my life. I haven't actually had a ton of time to think through this. What I have thought about is this. I don't think it is actually the moon in this story that we're supposed to be looking at. I think the fact that he included the moon in this story in a number of Easter egg-like ways is to help us now that he's bookended the story and given us this final video at the end for Drag Path. It's supposed to signify that we're supposed to look for the equivalent of the moon, but not just the moon. The moon is there as an Easter egg to point us towards the fact that we're supposed to be looking for the equivalent of the moon in this story. The moon's a little too obvious. It's a little too there. And again, I could be wrong. It could still be the moon. That could still play a major role in this. However, he very distinctly said in that interview, the moon is something that's there, you don't think it's important, and at the end is the thing that saves the bunny. And if we look at the bunny as corresponding to the character of Clancy in the dema story, playing a similar role, being sort of mapping on to that character, then it would seem to me that we're supposed to be looking for something that will save him in the end. And I don't think we've seen him saved, to be fair. But I don't think it's going to be the moon that saves him, because, as is mentioned here by Make It With Alex, it is during the night that Clancy seems to be struggling with his fears most, or succumbing to them most, or losing to them, right? That's part of the reason why we think that the jumpsuit flashback has it at night instead of daytime, because it's sort of Nico putting that in his mind. Because the nights when he struggles with his fears, he doesn't have hope. The morning sun, right, is what brings hope. But that doesn't mean I think it's the morning sun that saves him either. I think there's something else that's a lot more subtle Again, Moon's too obvious. There's something much more subtle in the story that's there that we haven't noticed. We don't see, and we haven't been given the ending, so it's hard for us to see it. It's harder than it is in the Out of a Forest video. We ignore the moon all the way through the first time we watch it, but then the second time we notice it's there because it's been shown at the end that saves him. We haven't been shown the ending. We've just been shown through Dragpath that there is an ending to come, and then we've, I think, been given the clues to predict what that ending is. I'm still struggling to figure out what it is. I have some theories, but like I said, I haven't had a ton of time to think about them yet. I want to think about them more before I sort of present them. But I have some theories, some of which tie into things I've presented in the past, or play off of things that I've thought about and presented in the past that would sort of seem to tie up some of those loose ends. But even that, I feel like might be a little less consistent, right? I mean, what we're looking for is something that is there, and it feels like it's just naturally there, but it also is a bit more important than just being naturally there. Because obviously, if it's too subtle and we just completely can't predict it, there's no way we would be able to understand this clue that I think he's dropped. The yellow flowers, for instance, I don't think it's the yellow flowers, right? We see them fairly consistently throughout. I mean, not as consistently as I would like, but just for an example, right? Seeing them in Jumpsuit, we see them in Nico and the Niners, we see one in Routines in the Night, I think. There's like sort of this Bandito flower that plays throughout. It's very subtle, but I don't think that's what's going to come at the end and save him, and there's no way to predict that. But it could be, right, at the end, like, you could imagine something really obscure turning into something that saves him without us having any way to foresee that. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think what we're talking about is something perhaps like the car. This is something that I can't take credit for. I've seen other people floating this idea around. Car is something that we see from the beginning in Heavy Dirty Soul. We see it in the Bandito imagery. Why is the car in the Bandito camp? We see it in Next Semester. We see it in Jumpsuit. We see it in the Breach Tour, and so on. Could the car be what saves him? I think not. I mean, perhaps so, because I think it's supposed to be an image of something that's like a scary, fearful moment in his life, a sort of weapon of destruction in his life. And so by destroying it in Heavy Dirty Soul, that's sort of him overcoming it, and then we see that carcass as like a symbol of hope throughout the rest of the story. The Next Semester kind of tells us this fact, or keys us into the backstory of the car. But that's like an example of something that somehow that could be what saves him, right? Like somehow there's something that we missed with the car that if we figure it out, we understand how he makes it out in Dragpath, how the story ends, or the alternate ending where he, in the future down the road, is free and is saved. Again, I'm not sold on the car, but something like that, something that's not so subtle that's like a blade of grass or a plant, but is a key aspect of the story that we just are like, oh yeah, it's there, it's part of the cool imagery of the story or the music video or whatever. We don't think much beyond that. But yeah, in short, I'm not sold on it being the moon. In fact, right now my working theory is that it couldn't be the moon. The moon elements are placed there as a hint for us that we are supposed to look for whatever it actually is. Next up, we have this comment. Lisa Burson writes, Tower writing skilled and icy, please elaborate a time I missed. So I think this is in response to the fact that Clancy wrote skilled and icy while in a tower trapped by the bishops inside Dema. So that's the short answer. If this is an element of the lore that you missed, I won't dwell too long on this because I think a fair number of people are caught up on this, but essentially during the Skilled and Icy era, after the Trench era, Clancy is captured, brought back to Dema, trapped in a tower, and forced to write a propaganda piece for the bishops called Skilled and Icy. It's revealed to us pretty early on that Skilled and Icy is propaganda, right? That's an Easter egg that we get given with Christmas Saves the Year before Skilled and Icy comes out. So he's trapped in the tower, and we learn that he's trapped in the tower through letters that were released around the time, or around Saturday, I think maybe, outlining how they trapped him in the tower. They forced him to write to create the show. He performs the show as a propaganda piece for the citizens of Dema on behalf of the bishops to further their message and promote vialism. That's sort of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about him writing Skilled and Icy in a tower. If you have further follow-ups, feel free to ask them. I'm sure I or other commenters can help clarify it more, but certainly go and read the letters that came out around this time. I mean, read all the letters, definitely, but if you're curious about this in particular, or you have a question about that, read the letters around that. They provide a lot of context to the story of writing this album within the lore. I mean, in short, Skilled and Icy is one of the coolest albums because it's an album that exists within Dema and Trench in canon. That album has been heard by the citizens of Dema and us. Suki Marmalade writes, Perligo Punter, so maybe everyone else knows and has realized this, but I just now heard this. It started by another click on a Paladin reaction, whose name I cannot now recall, pointing out that the last sound of the Paladin Straight music video is the first sound City Walls, for whatever reason I just didn't notice before. But then I realized Dragpath music video also begins with the same sound as city walls. Now I'm off to re-listen to the contract. This reminds me of the last note of Leave the City being the first note of truce. My question to you is, first, what do you think is the significance of those common sounds in the first 3 songs I mentioned? And second, can you think of any other instances where this occurs, excepting the heavy, dirty sound at the end of City Walls and My Blood after navigating in the music video? Very good question. Okay, significance. I think the significance in these instances between Paladin Strait and City Walls, at the end of Paladin Strait, I think it really was just to tease the fact that the story is not over. That little bit of music, that little couple notes or whatever, that glimpse of a melody that we got at the end of Paladin Strait was what we had to hold on to when we were unsure if there was going to be anything more after Paladin Strait. We went into Paladin Strait thinking it was going to be the end of the story. And so then we are left on this cliffhanger and we think that can't possibly be the end. And then we hear that little bit of melody. And that was like the confirmation we needed to know there was going to be something more. We weren't sure what. And then obviously City Walls came out. That beginning of that song mapped perfectly onto the end of Paladin Strait, as makes sense. I think that's why that was there. As I just explained with Drag Path, I think it sort of introduces, here is an ending to the story. City Walls was an ending to the story. Drag Path is an alternate ending. And then other instances of this happening. Before we get into that, the My Blood instance, I think, was significant to sort of illustrate further who the Torchbearer was and the role he was playing in the story. You didn't really ask about that, so I won't delve further into that. The other instance where I can think of right off the bat of a different song playing at the start or end of a song or a music video is the music video for Next Semester starts with part of the riff in Navigating. And I think that's it. Jumpsuit ends with the beginning of Levitate, but that's because those songs flow together on that album, Trench, from one track to the next. So I don't know if that fully counts. That's another one I can think of, but, I don't know if that quite is what you're meaning. And then obviously we have like Bandito sampled in Overcompensate, but that's also a little different. All right, and then the final comment for the night comes from Booker Cat. Hey, Perligo. So my mom is starting to like 21 Pilots, specifically Scaled and Icy. Her favorites are Good Day, Choker, Mulberry Street. What other songs would be good for her because I'm blanking? Sorry, this is 11 days late. Hopefully it's still relevant. It seems like a bit of a timely question that I ignored until now. If she's getting into 21 Pilots and she likes Good Day, Choker, and Mulberry Street, but trying to branch out from Scaled and Icy, I would probably recommend, and feel free to throw suggestions in yourself, but I would probably recommend Lavish, Garbage, maybe Raw Fear, maybe Robot Voices. I don't know. That's more like other songs than Skilled and Icy than those 3 specifically, but maybe Robot Voices. Midwest Indigo, perhaps. Legend. Smithereens. Maybe some stuff off of Vessel. Those are the main suggestions that come to mind. I think those are ones that are similar in style, but then will help introduce her to those other albums. That being said, that was 12 comments and questions for Perligo Ponders today. Thank you for all your comments for Perligo Ponders, and if you like your own comment featured in the next episode, simply comment something interesting down below. Feel free to tag it as Perligo Ponders if you would like, but I don't just pull comments with that tag.